In the summer of 1980, a thin, gray-haired man stepped out of a Moscow apartment, intending to go to his research institute, and instead was pushed into a car by plainclothes officers. He was Andrei Dmitrievich Sakharov, one of the chief designers of the Soviet hydrogen bomb. His government had made him a hero of socialist labor 3 times, given him a luxury apartment, and entrusted him with the most secret work in the country. Now, for criticizing that same government's war in Afghanistan and its repression at home, it was shipping him into internal exile. For Americans watching from the other side of the Iron Curtain, this was a moment loaded with irony. The man the Kremlin had relied on to keep up with U.S. nuclear technology had turned against the arms race and become the most famous dissident in the Soviet Union. To understand how that happened, you have to start decades earlier, when Sakharov was a young physicist in a system determined to catch up with the United States at any cost. Andrei Sakharov was born in Moscow in 1921 into a cultured scientific family. His father was a physics teacher and popular science writer, and his mother came from an old intelligentsia background. As a boy, he loved tinkering with radios and reading physics texts, and by the late 1930s, he was studying at Moscow State University, one of the Soviet Union's elite institutions. During the Second World War, he worked in a munitions factory, designing improvements to artillery shells, while continuing his theoretical studies by correspondence. He graduated with distinction and in 1947 joined the Lebedev Institute of Physics in Moscow. At that moment, the nuclear balance between the United States and the Soviet Union was brutally clear. The U.S. had developed and used atomic bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki and was moving quickly into an era of larger stockpiles and more advanced designs. The Soviet Union, still devastated by war, lacked both the industrial capacity and the technological infrastructure that American labs like Los Alamos enjoyed. Stalin's regime responded with a crash program, a combination of forced mobilization of its best physicists, vast investment in secret facilities, and heavy reliance on espionage to steal U.S. secrets. Sakharov's entry into weapons work was part of that drive to close a widening technological gap. In 1948, Sakharov was assigned to a top-secret installation often referred to as Arzamas-16, the Soviet equivalent of Los Alamos. There he worked under Igor Tamm and other senior physicists on the next generation of nuclear weapons, the hydrogen bomb. The United States had already tested its first thermonuclear devices, leveraging advanced calculations, industrial-scale cryogenics, and high-speed diagnostics that the Soviets struggled to match. Soviet leaders feared falling hopelessly behind in a world where American bombers, and soon missiles, could deliver unprecedented destruction. Sakharov's contribution was a key innovation, the so-called layer cake design, stacking layers of fission and fusion fuel in a configuration that allowed the Soviets to build their first practical hydrogen bomb without exactly duplicating U.S. designs. The device, RDS-6S, was tested successfully in August 1953. It was not as powerful as later H-bombs, but it proved that the USSR could match the United States at the thermonuclear level. For this work, Sakharov was showered with honors. He became one of the youngest full members of the Academy of Sciences and was named Hero of Socialist Labor 3 times. At that stage, he believed he was helping secure his country. The United States seemed to have a clear strategic and technological lead. Without a comparable arsenal, the USSR could be coerced or attacked. Matching American nuclear power felt like a grim necessity. But as the 1950s turned into the 1960s, that logic began to crumble in his mind. The arms race did not stop when the Soviets got the bomb. Both superpowers pushed ahead, testing larger and larger devices, deploying more missiles, and contemplating scenarios of overkill that made no sense to a scientist who understood the physics of fallout and the fragility of the planet's atmosphere. In the 1960s, Nikita Khrushchev decided to stage a show of force. He ordered the development of a colossal hydrogen bomb with a planned yield of 100 megatons to be tested in the atmosphere over the Arctic. The test that eventually took place, known in the West as the Tsar Bomba, was reduced to about 50 megatons, but even that explosion was the most powerful nuclear detonation in history. Sakharov opposed the full 100-megaton plan, arguing inside the secret community that such a test would produce unacceptable radioactive fallout and that there was no rational military purpose for such destructive power. He lost that internal battle, but the debate left a deep mark. He saw how political leaders, dazzled by megatons and prestige, ignored or downplayed the long-term consequences. He began to grasp that the technological race with America produced weapons that, if ever used, would render ideas of victory meaningless. The same advanced physics and engineering that put the United States ahead in missiles, electronics, and reconnaissance had also created a world where a miscalculation could wipe out both systems in minutes. By the late 1960s, Sakharov's doubts had hardened into a broader critique. In 1968, he wrote a long essay titled Reflections on Progress, Peaceful Coexistence, and Intellectual Freedom. It was not published inside the Soviet Union, but it circulated in samizdat and reached the West, where it was printed widely. In it, he argued that technological progress posed both unprecedented dangers and opportunities, that nuclear war would be catastrophic for humanity, and that only a combination of arms control, environmental protection, and respect for human rights could provide a path forward. He criticized his own government's repression and lack of freedom of thought, and he warned that without genuine intellectual freedom, any society, including the Soviet Union, would be unable to solve the complex problems created by modern technology. He did not spare the West. He criticized Western militarism and the risk of accidental war. But his strongest words were reserved for the Soviet leadership's refusal to allow open debate and its persecution of dissidents. The reaction in Moscow was swift. The essay was banned. Sakharov was removed from all secret defense work and expelled from the closed nuclear city. He was reassigned to the Lebedev Institute in Moscow, where he continued theoretical work in physics but was kept away from classified projects. The message was clear. He had crossed a line. Yet he did not retreat. Instead, he moved further into public advocacy. In 1970, he helped establish the Committee for Human Rights in the USSR, an informal group that documented political repression, defended prisoners of conscience, and called for legal reforms. Sakharov wrote open letters to Soviet leaders, to foreign heads of state, and to international organizations, arguing that respect for human rights and the rule of law were not Western tricks, but universal necessities. Over the next decade, he intervened in dozens of individual cases, from Jewish refuseniks denied exit visas to Lithuanian, Ukrainian, and Russian dissidents facing trial. He stood outside courtrooms, wrote detailed petitions, and used his status as an academician to shield others where he could. In doing so, he echoed themes that had already emerged in Western policy, especially in the Helsinki Final Act of 1975, which tied European security to human rights obligations. The same year the Helsinki Accords were signed, the Norwegian Nobel Peace Prize awarded Sakharov the Nobel Peace Prize. The committee described him as a spokesman for the conscience of mankind and praised his fearless personal commitment to fundamental principles of peace. In his Nobel lecture, delivered by his wife Yelena Bonner because Soviet authorities refused to let him travel, he listed names of prisoners, called for an end to the arms race and declared that peace, progress, and human rights were inseparable. The Soviet state responded with anger. Official media denounced him as a traitor and a tool of Western propaganda. He was subjected to more intense surveillance, harassment, and vilification in the press. KGB chief Yuri Andropov reportedly labeled him domestic enemy number one, seeing in him a dangerous symbol that combined scientific prestige with moral authority. But the leadership stopped short of putting him on trial like other dissidents, calculating that imprisoning a Nobel laureate and world-famous physicist would harm the USSR's image abroad. Instead, they watched and waited. The breaking point came in 1979-1980, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. From the Kremlin's perspective, the invasion was a strategic move to shore up a friendly regime and counter what it saw as Western influence on its southern flank. From Sakharov's perspective, it was a disastrous aggression that would cost countless lives and further isolate the USSR internationally. He spoke out against the invasion, calling it a grave mistake. Within weeks, the state moved. On January 22, 1980, Sakharov was picked up on his way to work and taken to the Prosecutor General's office. There, officials stripped him of his awards and informed him that he was being banished from Moscow. There was no trial, no defense, no published sentence. He and Yelena Bonner were put on a plane under guard and flown to the city of Gorky, now Nizhny Novgorod. Gorky was chosen for a reason. It was a major industrial center, closed to foreigners because of sensitive military and shipbuilding facilities. By exiling Sakharov there, the regime ensured that Western journalists and diplomats could not visit him without special permission. He was placed in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, under constant KGB surveillance. There was no telephone in the apartment. All mail was censored. Manuscripts were confiscated in searches. The extent of the surveillance has been documented in later exhibits, including Sakharov under surveillance at the Nobel Museum, which shows KGB photos and notes from the period. Agents followed him and Bonner on walks, filmed visitors from parked cars, and recorded every attempt to communicate with the outside world. He was required to report regularly to the police and told that failing to do so would result in forcible escort or worse. Despite this pressure, Sakharov refused to be silent. He wrote letters and essays, some of which were smuggled out and published in the West. He went on hunger strikes to protest restrictions on Bonner's ability to travel abroad for medical treatment, forcing the authorities into awkward choices between letting his wife go or risking his death in custody. These actions drew international attention and reinforced his image as a man willing to risk his life for both personal and political principle. From an American point of view, the image of a Nobel-winning physicist responsible for helping the USSR reach nuclear parity, being held effectively under house arrest and watched all the clock, was deeply revealing. It showed how brittle the Soviet system was when faced with internal criticism that intersected with Western values. It highlighted the contrast between a society where debates about nuclear policy and human rights could play out on television, in Congress, and in universities, and one where such debates led to exile in a closed city. In the United States, the Sakharov case became a rallying point. Human rights organizations, scientific societies, and government officials repeatedly called for his release. The linkage he had drawn between arms control and human rights resonated with a growing consensus in Western policy that agreements like the SALT treaties and later START would be durable if the Soviet Union moved towards openness and respect for individual rights. The fact that this argument came from inside the Soviet nuclear establishment gave it special weight. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union was changing. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, promising perestroika and glasnost, restructuring and openness. He understood, as Sakharov had long argued, that the Soviet system could not keep up with Western technology and economic performance without major internal reform. The arms race with the U.S. had produced an enormous arsenal, but had also strained the Soviet economy to the breaking point. Gorbachev began to seek arms control agreements like the INF Treaty and to discuss deeper cuts in nuclear forces. Against that backdrop, keeping Andrei Sakharov in internal exile became increasingly untenable. In December 1986, Gorbachev picked up the phone and called Sakharov in Gorky. He told him that he was free to return to Moscow. The call, reported worldwide, marked a symbolic turning point, the Soviet leader personally releasing the man the KGB had once labeled domestic enemy number one. When Sakharov and Bonner returned to Moscow, they were greeted by fellow dissidents and reformers who saw in his release proof that glasnost was real. He was reinstated at the Academy of Sciences and resumed scientific work, but he also immediately plunged back into public life. In 1989, he was elected to the new Congress of People's Deputies, a national assembly created under Gorbachev as part of political reforms. Standing at the podium with television cameras broadcasting debates across the USSR, Sakharov called for genuine multi-party democracy, an independent judiciary, and a new constitution that would guarantee rights and limit state power. He worked on drafts of such a constitution in his final months. On December 14, 1989, he died suddenly of a heart attack in his Moscow apartment. He was 68. 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. Looking back, his life forms an arc that tracks the Cold War itself. As a young physicist, he helped the Soviet Union close a dangerous gap with the United States by building the H-bomb. In doing so, he played a key role in establishing the nuclear balance of terror that defined the strategic relationship for decades. But once that balance existed, he concluded that continuing to compete with America bomb for bomb was pointless and suicidal. He advocated arms control, verification, and cooperation, in effect, endorsing core elements of the U.S. strategic agenda from inside the rival camp. He also saw that the same technological and scientific advances that had created nuclear weapons required a different kind of political order to be managed safely. In a world where computers, missiles, and satellites could react in minutes, closed, unaccountable systems were too dangerous. He argued that only societies which allowed free inquiry, open criticism, and respect for individual rights could handle the consequences of their own technology. In this, he implicitly contrasted the Soviet model with the more open, law-bound, technologically advanced societies of the West. For American viewers, Sakharov's story is a powerful confirmation of what many in the United States believed about the Cold War. The U.S. invested heavily in science and technology, from the Manhattan Project to the Apollo program to microelectronics and advanced computing. It also created institutions, universities, courts, a free press, scientific societies, where debates about how to use those technologies could happen openly. The Soviet Union tried to respond with its own scientific elite, but kept it under tight political control. When one of its brightest physicists followed the logic of his field to its ethical conclusions, the state's reflex was to silence him. Yet even exile and surveillance could not fully contain him. His essays reached the West, influenced thinking about human rights and arms control, and inspired other dissidents. His Nobel Peace Prize and his later role in Gorbachev's reforms showed that ideas born in secret labs and samizdat pages could eventually reshape policy. And his life story, bombmaker turned dissident, academician turned internal exile, and finally, exiled scientist turned legislator in a crumbling empire, stands as a testament to the long-term strength of an open, technologically advanced society over a closed, fearful one. In the end, Andrei Sakharov's journey reflects a simple but profound Cold War truth. The Soviet Union could copy U.S. designs, mobilize entire cities for secret projects, and build bombs that matched American yields. What it could not do, without undermining itself, was give its own scientists the freedom to say what they thought about the consequences. The United States, with all its contradictions, could. And when the man who helped create the Soviet H-bomb ended his life arguing for democracy, human rights, and partnership with the West, It was a sign that the real advantage in that long struggle lay not only in hardware, but in the kind of system that produced and controlled it.